Thank you for joining us. Welcome, everybody. My name is Justin Hurdle. I'm a member of FCNL's Strategic Advocacy Team. You've probably received an email from me or two, but hopefully it was to get you here, and we're really excited that you're here. Some quick housekeeping. We're going to cover three main things in this call tonight. We're going to share FCNL's view of the new political landscape we find ourselves in and what it means for the issues we work on. We're going to cover three issues, but we'll touch on some others, and we know there's a lot of issues on people's minds. We're going to be focusing tonight on protecting healthcare and food assistance, especially for poor and working families. We're going to be talking with Anika about preventing funding for harmful immigration enforcement and detention. And we'll hear from Hassan about restoring aid to Gaza and pursuing peace in the Middle East. And lastly, we'll take some questions, we'll get some answers, and we'll end with discussing ways that you can take action after this call and over the months ahead. We will have time, about 20 minutes for questions. So you should see, if you're joining us on Zoom, in the bottom, a Q&A button. You can submit questions there. We'll be collecting those. And a big thank you to people who shared questions and comments when registering for this call. It helped us understand where people were coming from. We know people are coming with a lot on their hearts, a lot on their minds. So we hope we can speak to some of those. And lastly, I'm gonna just say, really use that chat. We are sad that we can't see you right now, but we're seeing that chat live right now. Tell us where you're coming from, share what's on your mind, pitch ideas as you hear about the issues and the actions we'll be discussing, and be in community with one another and with us here on the call. Tell us if you're a member of an advocacy team, what your meeting is, who you are here to take action in solidarity with. And now I'm really pleased to introduce Bridget Moix. She's FCNL's General Secretary, and she recently celebrated her 3rd anniversary. So we are really excited for Bridget to kick us off tonight. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Justin, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. Justin mentioned it was my 3rd year anniversary in this role as General Secretary, but I'm going on 30 years with this community doing work together. And we are at such an important moment to come together and really be inspired by all we're going to hear, really lift our spirits from the tremendous, devastating place we've been feeling we're in, to keep defending and building that world we seek. So before we begin and dive in, I want us to just take a breath together. It has been such a heavy week and few days since this administration was inaugurated, and we have been barraged every day, nearly every hour, by the next crisis, it feels. So let's just take a breath together and gather here together in this space. Thank you. I do want to acknowledge all the feelings that we are probably bringing into this space right now. We want to spend time energizing, activating, informing you, but we know that you, like all of us, are coming now together at a time of tremendous backsliding, tremendous chaos in our country, tremendous policy changes that are literally looking to rewrite our democracy and our country. So there's real harm that's happening. And I just want to acknowledge that, because we need to work from those feelings of rage and anger and fear and despair. We need to turn that into a feeling of community, of knowing that we can work together to continue making change, even in the midst of all that is coming at us right now. So I know if you're like me, you probably have at moments over the past week felt almost completely overwhelmed, perhaps feeling helpless. What in the world can we possibly do against everything that is happening? How do we even keep up? How are we going to make it through the next 4 years and everything that is happening and can happen. And what will our country and our world become through all of this? So I just want to tell a story about how, for me, having moments of turning those sense of helplessness into hope and reminders of the action that we can take have been so important. I have two sons. They're teenage boys, Pablo and Santiago, and they are half Mexican. Their father is an immigrant, now a citizen. We have all kinds of fears. I wake up in the middle of the night with fears about my own family, even though we're so much safer than so many people in this country. And so Pablo, my older son, he was, watching all this news. He's absorbing everything that's happening. He's going to be 17 soon. And he was asking me, Mom, can they do this? Is this possible? What is happening? How can Trump and the administration take all these actions? How is this possible? And it sort of gave me a moment to figure out, how am I going to answer this question for my son? And I paused and said, no, you know what? We do still live in a democracy, actually. There are three branches of government, and we can take action to push back against what's happening. We have the courts, and some of you may have heard, Quakers have now sued the Trump administration over taking away the protections of houses of worship against immigration raids. And I'm so grateful, and it was such a moment of inspiration and encouragement when those yearly meetings in churches filed that lawsuit just yesterday. And we have another branch of government as well. We have Congress, and Congress is where we have the ability and the responsibility to act, and we can. And so I was reminded again of how important it is to be here with FCNL, this work that we can do together, that we all can have a voice, we can all take action, and every action, no matter how small or no matter how great, is a step forward. It is a way of building and engaging our power. And we are powerful. And our kids and our country and our world is relying on us. So every action that we take will matter. We want to spend time with you this evening, informing you about what is happening on the Hill on some of the big issues that we need your action on, giving you resources and tools, and encouraging and inspiring one another to take action in this 119th Congress. We are going to welcome this Congress with courage, with action, and with our continued commitment to the world we seek, a world of justice, of peace, of sustainability, and of human dignity for all. So we can make a difference, and I'm so excited that we are all here together in community. It is in community that we will make change, and we will live into that beloved community that we know is still possible, and that we will stand in the gap between where we are right now and how overwhelming that can feel, and the world that we seek that we know is still waiting for us. So I'm very excited to turn it over to some of FCNL's most inspiring lobbyists to talk to us about the issues in front of Congress where we can take action. So I will turn over first to the always inspiring Amelia Keegan, our Associate General Secretary for Policy and Advocacy. Amelia, over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. And I just want to say, in a moment like this, how grateful I am to be in community with you all. It has been a week, right? It's not even 10 days, but it feels like months have passed since Inauguration Day. And we've seen, as Bridget was saying, we've seen this flurry of executive orders, guidance memos from the new administration. There's chaos, institutions threatened. Last week, all foreign assistance was frozen. Last night, OMB issued this memo freezing all federal assistance domestically. And there's so much confusion about what programs are affected and how, and now a judge has blocked that freeze on federal assistance. This is where we are, right? This is our new reality. Sudden announcements, dramatic changes in policy with draconian consequences. Yet at the same time, there are these huge legislative efforts that are underway in Congress that are still, as Bridget said, major implications for communities and families all across this country. So as we gather tonight, we're here to talk through, what does the path forward look like? How can we be most effective and have the greatest impact in this moment? We have work to do. We cannot do it all. We cannot respond to everything. There's going to be litigation. There's going to be resistance efforts and nonviolence direct action. FCNL can play a supporting role for some of this, but in this environment, we're going to stay focused. FCNL's power really lies with Congress, and Congress has such a critical role in what we're facing, right? We have some major legislation coming down the pike. We have some major budget questions coming down the pike. A lot is at stake, and so we're really going to need to be working with you and partnering with you in efforts to really get Congress to act and play its role in a lot of the questions and policy decisions that are coming down the pike, but also in kind of pushing back against some of what we're seeing coming from the administration. So just quick opening, kind of setting the stage there, and I will turn it back to Justin.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, friends in the chat, for pointing out our image and audio challenge there. We're back on track, and thank you, friends, for letting us know where you're calling in from, where you're joining us from, and to report we are up to over 570 friends and others here who are trying to figure out how to take action and how to put values and faith and their communities into this advocacy. And before we turn it over and really dive into these top issues and opportunities and threats that we're working on over the next few months, we want to talk a little bit about the new Congress. One thing that I find extremely troubling, in addition to everything we've already been hearing, is because of Trump and President Trump taking such quick action, it takes away from some of the work that you can do on the congressional side, where a lot of our power lies, as Amelia said. And one of these opportunities that we invite folks to really think about is if you have a new member of Congress. This 119th session of Congress has more than 60 new representatives and 14 new senators. That leads to opportunities for relationship building. And you're going to hear about relationship building several times tonight. It's hard. This work is hard, but it's so important. And with new members of Congress, it's an opportunity, especially to invite them to learn about not just you and your priorities and issues you care about, but your community, whether that is your Quaker meeting or church or another faith tradition, or your book club or your group that gets together to talk about and act on the things that you want to see changed in your community and in your nation. So one thing we want to really emphasize in this section before we dive into these issues is think about how you invite someone into a relationship. And one of the most important pieces of that is learning what they care about and where you can find connection and where you can find opportunity for discussion. Oftentimes we talk about building relationships with your member of Congress, and that's really important. And some people are able to do that a little bit easier if you have a bit more access. So we like to talk about how you build those relationships with staffers. I like to talk about, that staffer you might meet with at a district office that might be in a strip mall. It might be in a federal building. But those people who you're meeting with are your neighbors. They're people who their kids go to the same school as yours. They shop at the same grocery store. They know what's happening on the ground as well. And you can build that relationship. Some of you may meet with Washington, D.C. based staff in virtual lobbying. We've seen a lot of virtual lobbying lead to really wonderful relationship building opportunities. And when folks come to D.C. sometimes and they get to meet that staffer face to face in person, all of a sudden it just really, you see that relationship blossom and the conversation becomes people's shoulders sit back and they know that they're talking to someone they can have a real conversation with. So one thing we want to invite folks to do, whether you have a new member or not, is when you're engaging these offices, it's introduce them to FCNL, introduce them to some of our policy solutions, introduce your community to them, whatever definition community you want to use. So this will be our first link in the chat. And I want to say we will have lots of links shared tonight. Everyone who's on this call will receive a follow-up email tomorrow, and these links will be in that email as well. So don't feel like you have to go and save all those links, but we have put together some resources for friends who have new legislators. I know some, like our Santa Cruz, San Jose, California friends have already been meeting with their new member of Congress, introducing them to FCNL and our work. So these resources include one of my new favorite things, a welcome letter that Quaker meetings, churches, or groups can use to not just introduce themselves, but the concerns and policy priorities of that specific group or community. So we hope that can be a useful tool to not just introduce FCNL as a resource and our lobbyists, some of whom are on this call, but also how you can invite them to engage you on the priorities that you find important. And that can be FCNL's priorities, or it can be some priorities that are much more local, that are of top concern. So I'm going to turn it back over to Amelia, and we're going to start this conversation of these important issues that we need to take action on. Amelia, back to you.
Thanks, Justin. So to start us off, the top legislative priority for the incoming Congress and new administration is this budget reconciliation bill that you may have been hearing about. It would take healthcare and food assistance away from potentially tens of millions of people in this country, and then pay for extending and doubling down on the 2017 tax cuts, which were extremely regressive, as well as paying for the massive investments that they're going to make in deportation, detention, border militarization, as well as the Department of Defense. Anika's going to speak more to the deportation and detention part of this reconciliation bill. But I want to spend a little time around the threats to healthcare and nutrition assistance. So just a quick kind of reminder, as you may know, budget reconciliation is this fast track process that is used when there is a trifecta. Both chambers of Congress and the White House are all controlled by the same party. And it is an avenue where you only need 50 votes in the Senate. There's limited debate. It can't be filibustered to be able to pass legislation that has major budgetary consequences. The new majority in Congress has a very aggressive timeline. They want to move this legislation and get it done within the first 100 days. That is a tall order, but we have to take them seriously on that. So there is a lot on the chopping block, but we continue to see through leaked documents that two programs kind of have the biggest targets right now are Medicaid and SNAP. Now, these are programs that impact so many people, right? We're talking about 70 million people in this country who get health coverage through Medicaid. It covers 2 out of every 5 births in this country, 3/5 of people in nursing care facilities. And the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, that reaches more than 40 million people, helping them buy groceries and put food on the table. That's 1 in 5 kids, right? So the implications of this are huge. I want to quickly run through the threats that we see to these programs and then the path forward of how we can push back and potentially prevent these cuts from happening. So Medicaid threats, there are 3 that we really see at the top of the list. One is work requirements. We continue to see these narratives around who is deserving, right, of government assistance. And it's oftentimes ignored when we're talking about benefits in the tax code that goes to those who have more privilege, but oftentimes so scrutinized the most for individuals who have the lowest incomes. And we have examples and data of what happened in Arkansas and Georgia with work requirements on Medicaid, showing that this is really bureaucratic red tape, right? Onerous monthly reporting requirements. And in Arkansas, in the first 7 months that they implemented work requirements, 18,000 people, or 1 in 4 people subject to the requirement, lost coverage. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that implementing work requirements would put 36 million people at risk of losing their health coverage. The second is reducing the amount of federal matching or federal government the federal government contributes to Medicaid to states for Medicaid. This is harmful for a number of reasons, but particularly in the context of the Medicaid expansion, many states have what are referred to as trigger laws for the states that if the federal government reduces the matching amount for even a dime of that Medicaid expansion, the Medicaid expansion disappears. Congress could also eliminate the Medicaid expansion altogether. There are about 20 million people who have health coverage through the Medicaid expansion. And the third is the block grant or per capita cap. It's basically restructuring how Medicaid is funded. Right now, as an entitlement or mandatory spending program, the amount that is spent on Medicaid is determined by how many people are eligible. So when we face a recession or something like that, and people's incomes go down, they qualify for Medicaid, the program automatically expands, and it's very, very beneficial. We don't have to wait for Congress to provide additional funding, and it's a powerful countercyclical effect to the economy as well. If we look at the history of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, we can see what block granting does to a program over time, and how problematic that is. Really quickly, the threats to SNAP, preventing updates or cutting the existing updates to the Thrifty Food Plan, which calculates kind of the amount for SNAP benefits based on what it costs for a nutritious meal. Those were recently updated for the first time in 50 years, and there are efforts to kind of pull that back. Again, SNAP already has work requirements, but there are some exceptions. For example, in areas with high unemployment, it doesn't make sense to penalize someone for not having a job when there are no jobs. Other people like veterans, individuals who are experiencing homelessness, parents of school-aged kids, there are proposals to take away these exemptions. And additionally, block granting or requiring states to cover some of the cost of SNAP. And then I just want to really quickly say, this is going to, in the context, in the same bill, continuing to put on hyperdrive, orienting our tax code and economy to further advantage the wealthiest and most privileged in our society, right? Benefiting billionaires over families. And I just want to give you one quick stat. Extending the Trump tax cuts would give the richest 0.1% $314,000 tax cut each year. So again, misalignment of our priorities, further exacerbate the racial wealth gap and undermine our democracy. So quickly, the timeline. Look, there's a lot of talk in Washington. I don't know if you're following it all about, is there going to be one reconciliation bill? Are there going to be two reconciliation bills? Right now, they're moving forward on one. But really, the policies and the impacts are the same. Whether you're taking healthcare and food away from people in one big bill or in two smaller bills, you're still taking healthcare and food away from people, right? And still doing it to pay for tax cuts and deportation. So the House is moving first. They're going to move a budget resolution in February. That then gives instructions to the different committees about how much they need to cut in their bills or how much savings they'll develop. And then the committees go off and write those bills. Then in March, the committees mark up those bills, and then they all come together and package together in one giant bill that then goes to the floor for a vote. So we want to make sure right now is a key window that we can shape these bills before they're drafted. So over the next 2 months, we need to get moderate members of Congress, particularly Republicans in the House and Senate, to go to leadership and say, I cannot vote for a bill that takes healthcare and food from my constituents. Do not make me take that vote. That is really where we're focusing on right now. Once it's written in the bill, there's going to be huge pressure to vote on it. We're still going to go out and make sure that they don't have the votes to pass it. But right now is a really critical time. And I want to emphasize, it's important to get to Republicans on this, but Democrats have a really important role too. If they can't get to 60, they might try and, if they can't get to 50, excuse me, they might try and go to Democrats to get the votes. But also, Democrats also have a really important role to lift up the consequences of these cuts and continue to amplify the message and the draconian implications of what we're seeing. I think we could win on this. It's going to be a challenge, but there is a very conceivable path where we prevent Congress from taking away healthcare and nutrition assistance from tens of millions of people. The margins are extremely tight in the House and the Senate. I was on a call with a couple very influential members of Congress last week or 2 weeks ago, where they said, this is the narrowest majority in the House since the 1800s. And when they finally fill the remaining seats, still the narrowest majority since the Great Depression, right? And even in the last Congress, when Republicans had a bigger majority, they could not pass bills without Democratic support. So there's still going to be enormous pressure to vote for this bill, but we really haven't, there is a path where we can really make a difference on this. So what can you do? If you're a young adult or you know young adults, our spring lobby weekend is March 22nd through the 25th. We're going to put that link in the chat. But this is the topic of spring lobby weekend. It's going to be a prime time to be lobbying on this issue. We want folks to come join us. We also have an action on our website that you can go and you can contact your members of Congress right now. And we really encourage you to personalize those messages to your members of Congress. And then express interest to us if you want to join or organize a lobby visit. Now is a really critical time to be communicating with your members of Congress on that. So that is the quick run through on my end. I'm now going to turn it over to Anika Forrest. She is FCNL's Legislative Director for Domestic Policy and our lead lobbyist on migration policy. Anika, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amelia, and thank you to everyone on this call. As Bridget and Amelia have uplifted, it's been a heavy and an enraging week. I know in the world of migration, we are holding the onslaught of asylum bans to suspensions of the refugee admissions as well as resettlement program, the weaponization of military forces at our border and also via deportation flights, devastating changes to our immigration detention laws for people who haven't even stepped foot one day in court for a hearing. We're seeing schools and houses of worship and hospitals fall prey to a political game. And we're holding all of that. Personally, as an advocate led by my Christian and biblical understandings, I find myself constantly thinking about and reminding myself to seek the heart of God and strive to honor his principles in this moment in the work that we're doing. And one edict is abundantly clear, that of loving thy neighbor as thyself. And I think if we challenged our members of Congress to be stewards of that, our policies would look a lot different. It's one of the greatest commandments. As FCNL would say, love thy neighbor, no exceptions. And we, no matter the path ahead of us, we are remembering to ensure that we honor the light of every individual in the way that policies are created in this country. And regardless of the path ahead of us, whether it's easy or whether it's hard, that level of empathy and compassion is what anchors and guides the work that we do. There are a lot of elements to the world that we seek we will not be able to achieve and accomplish in this moment, but we know change is possible. And so for the immediate, FCNL is really going to be focusing on how we can be responsive in this moment to the dire needs of communities, push back on cruelty, and do it in a way that can actually influence change. And so for that, a lot of it is going to be in the process that Amelia mentioned, that reconciliation and budget process. The Trump administration needs money, and it's going to need lots of it in order to carry out its mass deportation and mass detention agenda. In Congress, with the process that it'll be using, we will see lots of discussion and negotiations and debate. Nothing has officially been released yet. We don't have text by committees. There will be markups, but government officials have said that they are going to need at least $86 billion to carry out its intention. We've heard of proposals of $100 billion being floated for border walls, for deportation, for detention, just to ground us in that thinking, because when you start talking about multiple billions, that's hard to really wrap your mind around and reconcile. That's almost 5 times higher than annual levels that we've seen recently for Border Patrol and for immigration and customs enforcement. It's nearly 7-fold for some of these programs that we've seen since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And we know heightened enforcement is not the answer. It never has been, and it's never solved anything but more pain and more suffering. And so a lot of our work is going to be pushing back. Amelia gave a really great overview of the process and the timeline ahead of us, how moderate members of Congress and the Senate and the House are going to be critical to being able to mitigate as much harm as we can. And that bold strategy is going to be critical and important. And we're really grateful for partnership in this work and in this moment. Already, we see Congress and the administration attempting to politicize and desensitize mass deportation. There's a lot of harm that happens when we start dividing communities in that way, when we start weaponizing fear and concerns to advance a political agenda. And so part of what I want to ensure that we all hold is how much we have to remember who our undocumented community members are. Some of you may be on this call. We see you, we are holding you in the light, and we are working in solidarity with you. Our undocumented community members are our neighbors, our caregivers, our fellow congregants, our first responders. During the COVID-19 pandemic, over 5 million undocumented immigrants were essential workers who helped this country thriving and kept us safe despite all we were going through. There are doctors, lawyers, and the list goes on. Undocumented immigrants are unequivocally woven into the fabric of this country, and deportations will ensure fractures to families. Over 5 million US citizen children are going to be irrevocably impacted if we have mass deportations because of their family members who would be affected. We have already seen enough childhood separation at the hand of the Trump administration. It doesn't need to continue in any other facets or reiterations. It's a policy that we know would harm faith groups who are called to welcome their fellow neighbors, to welcome the newcomers. It would upend economic vitality in the United States. We'd see labor shortages. We'd see reductions in tax income. We would see less contributions to Social Security. We would see disruptions in spending power, increases in the cost of food. The Peterson Institute for International Economics reports that the GDP, so the measure of our nation's economic health, would be cut by as much as 7.4%. We'd see prices drive up almost 10% by 2028 at a time in which folks are already talking about inflation and how high cost of living is. We'd only see that increase at the hands of unchecked mass detention and deportation. And we know, as Amelia stated, our government right now is willing to sacrifice that and entertain it at the expense of basic necessities like healthcare and food assistance and food access for low income and poor families. This power of unchecked deportation cannot happen. What we should be investing in is housing and healthcare and food assistance. That should be the priority, not a blank check for cruelty towards our immigrant neighbors. We all want safety and healthy, stable, prosperous communities, and every single one of us deserves that peace. And this is not the answer, this is not the way. And the public knows that. A lot of recent polling has shown that the majority of US voters do not support mass and sweeping deportation and detention. And so it can only, I think, take us back to what we heard Bridget say at the top of this call about the level of chaos that is being sown. And a scripture has been on my heart a lot in this moment, that God is not an author of confusion, but is an author of peace. And we know that the chaos and the heartache and the rage and uncertainty that exists right now, it's not rooted in righteousness. It's not rooted in peace, because on the side of peace is justice, and that's what we're striving for. And so there are ways in which you can join us in this moment. But I know some of you, before you can even think about advocating, want to take care of your communities. And so FCNL has put together resources, know your rights materials, referrals to legal providers, to mental health services, so that you can become as informed as you need to be in this moment. And so we will be sharing that in the chat and in some of our follow-up. We also know, like I mentioned earlier, the public is not in support of this agenda. And so the administration, Congress needs to be hearing that. We need to localize, humanize, and personalize this discussion. And so even before we talk about getting to your members of Congress through traditional lobbying, and we need to see that, we also want to ensure that you are helping to change the way this conversation is developing. And so we are calling on all of you to write a letter of Congress to the editor in your local papers, uplifting why you are against mass deportation and detention, why this is an issue that impacts your community, why it's an issue that impacts you. you and how this cannot be the course that we are taking. And so we're going to be sharing more information about how you can write a letter to your editor. We've provided some top line thoughts and considerations. If you're like, I'm not sure how to even start, what are some of the points that I should be raising? We put some of that together for you. And then we also have our action alert. So you can write directly to your members of Congress, also ensuring that they do not support these high levels of funding and misdirected appropriations and accounting for mass deportation and mass detention. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Hassan El Tayeb, who's the legislative director for our Middle East program.
Anika, thank you so much. Really powerful words. Man, I've got some great colleagues over here at FCNL. And I'm also really inspired to see hundreds and hundreds of people on this call right now because, yeah, we are facing really just a lot right now. And to be here in community with everybody, I think is gonna be what we need to sustain ourselves and really move this work forward. So thank you all for being here. I also wanted to say we have somewhat good news here. We have a ceasefire in Gaza. And after more than 15 months of horrific violence in Gaza and across the Middle East, it is so welcome that Israel and Hamas have agreed to exchange dozens of hostages and really commit to this temporary pause in fighting. I think that's a testament to the work of tens of thousands of activists around the country, the FCNL network, faith allies, veterans, human rights, humanitarians, just really so many different people working in solidarity. So thank you. And I think these exchanges acknowledge the fundamental truth that every life has inherent value, whether or not they're Israeli or Palestinian. But we know the work is not done. We applaud this agreement, but we also lament that it comes far too late for tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians who have lost their lives, their limbs, and their loved ones due to indiscriminate bombings and severe aid restrictions. It also comes far too late for 1,200 Israeli civilians killed on October 7 and nearly 100 Israeli hostages and their families who have really been living in agony, separated from their loved ones for well over a year. And so it's just amazing. One of my Palestinian colleagues said today was actually the happiest day of his life because tens of thousands of Palestinians are finally able to return to their home in northern Gaza. So that's got to touch all of us. And while this is a critical step forward for peace, we know at FCNL the work is far from over. We need to secure a permanent ceasefire. We need to ensure the release of all remaining Israeli hostages, Palestinian political prisoners, provide unfettered humanitarian access, and work to support a just and lasting peace. We need continued diplomatic engagement, not just in Gaza, not just in the West Bank, which is escalating, but also in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran, to prevent more needless suffering. And we know that right now we have this really critical window with the fragile ceasefire. We need to flood Gaza with as much humanitarian assistance as possible. And that's why I'm so grateful to the FCNL Advocacy Team Network for partnering with us on restoring UNRWA funding to not just Gaza, but the West Bank and across the region. The United States cut off this funding in response to allegations that 12 of the literally 30,000 UNRWA employees in the region had participated in the October 7 attacks. And we think that this was unjust, and we're making really important steps to try to restore that funding. Just dig into a little bit more on this. These U.S. actions were really a knee-jerk response, and it's become clear that there was an unjustified rush to judgment against UNRWA, and other countries, key U.S. allies, have all restored this funding, and it's time that the United States join that group. This is going to be a very challenging, issue for sure, but we think that this is a really important focus for the FCNL Advocacy Team Network in definitely the first couple of months here as we approach the March appropriations deadline. There are 4 key reasons why we are supporting this. One, as I said earlier, UNRWA is the backbone of all aid delivery in Gaza. And blocking this funding is really only going to exacerbate an already catastrophic humanitarian crisis for millions of Palestinians experiencing displacement, hunger, and disease. Again, we have the ceasefire, but there's so much more that needs to be done. Continuing to block this funding doesn't just affect Gaza. This is going to affect Jerusalem, the West Bank, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, where literally millions of Palestinians depend on these services for survival, education, shelter, and sustainment. And we know that if we stop UNRWA funding and continue the pause on this agency, we're going to see even more regional instability. In response, also, this is number 3, in response to the Israeli allegations, UNRWA took steps that are exactly what you'd expect from a professional organization. They immediately fired the 12 accused employees. The UN ordered an inspector general investigation and commissioned an independent outside review. And it came back that UNRWA has taken all concrete steps to implement the recommendations and has performed as a professional humanitarian operation should. And again, after prompt action by UNRWA and the UN, as additional facts have come to light, every major country on earth has restored funding. And again, the United States remains one of the last countries that has not. So we're leaning into this. We are hoping that folks join FCNL advocacy teams this year as we work to restore humanitarian funding and to stop these offensive weapon sales to the Israeli government this year, because we think food is important, not more bombs and weapons of war. So absolutely a critical campaign, and we hope you join us. We also have an UNRWA quorum action. If folks want to take a quick look at that, I think Justin may have shared it in the chat. You can just email your members of Congress. And we are expecting the reintroduction of the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act, led by Reps. Carson, Jayapal, and Schakowsky on the House side. That's actually I just heard from their staff that it started circulating around the House yesterday. And we're also expecting a reintroduction of the Senate version by Senator Welch and some of his colleagues. So really an exciting moment to dive into this campaign with us. And I'd be remiss if I didn't end with another piece of overwhelmingly good news, because my God, we need as much good news as possible right now. Folks may have seen that there was a House bill, HR 23. This was a bill led by Rep. Roy to sanction the International Criminal Court. A lot of people were angry that the ICC had put arrest warrants out, for some Israeli leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, as well as Yahya Sinwar. They were worried that the ICC was singling out Israel. But FCNL was deeply concerned about this bill. It did pass through the House. Granted, it was there were many folks that opposed, almost a party line vote. Some Democrats went over with the Republicans and voted for it. But we saw that the Senate actually blocked this bill today. So the future is uncertain, but we know that the Congress is not going to be passing legislation to sanction the ICC just yet. And again, that was as a result of a ton of activism across the FCNL advocacy teams network, just really across the whole faith community, Churches for Middle East Peace, and so many others. So thank you for your work on that. This bill would have undermined, the United States' stance as a global advocate for justice and accountability. And imposing these sanctions would significantly obstruct the ability of civil society and human rights organizations in the U.S. and abroad to present evidence of war crimes by any actor, including, war crimes going on, in Ukraine by the Russian government. So, we want to protect these international institutions, and this is absolutely a huge win. So our appreciation goes out to every Democratic senator who voted against that, especially Senator Shaheen, who really leaned into this and led the effort to block the legislation. So really appreciate it. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Justin here, but this is going to be an exciting year of advocacy. We need it. We need solidarity. We need all hands on deck, and looking forward to working with you.
Wow, I really appreciate Hassan in the office today. He came up to the third floor, was really excited about this great news about the ICC and the ICC bill and the vote. And I looked at him and said, Hassan, you have to talk about that on the call. I think one thing we talk about here at FCNL a lot, especially these days, is how do you, in the midst of everything that you're reading, that you're seeing on TV, that you see in your email inbox or those push notifications, how do you celebrate even those small victories? And that's not to say that this ICC vote is a small victory. As Hassan said, this is a big deal. And one thing we're trying to invite you into is let us know about those small victories. And when I talked earlier about relationship building, building those relationships takes small victories over time. And that's one way that, individually, or I'm seeing in the chat, folks from advocacy teams talking about their successes. Shout out to our New Hampshire friends who've really worked hard to lobby Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan. Living into your values and really looking for ways to elevate those small victories and snowball them into larger victories locally, as well as here in Washington is just really important. So as you continue your advocacy, let us know about those small victories and how we can support each other. You can do that through emailing us at lobby@fcnl.org. On our various social media accounts, our comms team wants us to really shout that out. I've seen in the chat talking about different ways to connect. So on those FCNL social media accounts on Blue Sky, on Facebook, our YouTube page, I think we're trying to be a bit more active there, on TikTok, of course, and then our email list. We've seen a growth of people interested in knowing exactly why you're on this call. What can you do? How can I get into these offices? How can I make a difference? Reply to those emails and tell us about those small victories. The staff here at FCNL, when we get those stories from advocacy teams, from our advocacy core organizers, the Young Adult Network, friends around the country, we circulate those to staff. I think at least a couple times a week, we're trying to uplift those, and then we get those out to other members of the community. So we have talked about a lot, and there have been a lot of issues, a lot of information brought through. And like I said, I hope you don't try and capture all of those links. They'll be in the follow-up email tomorrow. And right now, thank you to everybody who's been submitting questions. We're going to start going through some of these questions. We'll be calling on our panelists here, but please keep the questions coming, and we will get to as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. So this first question, Amelia, we're going to come to you. Given the billions of dollars that flow through these large programs in terms of Medicaid, SNAP, Medicare, the many programs you were talking about, are there strong constituencies for them? And can you speak to some of the partners that you're working with and how others can get involved?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the kind of ways in which we think the advocacy on this is so important, is because when you're talking about, 1 in 5 kids in a, receiving SNAP or 2/3 of all births in the United States, 70 million people in this country, that is such a wide ranging. So I think, we are kind of looking at lifting up stories of people who would be impacted, I think, is the biggest thing, and showing that this is not a blue state issue or a red state issue or an urban issue or a rural issue. It's like it is all across the country. So that's kind of where we are. We're partnering with, a number of other faith groups, a number of other service providers, others who the disability community is particularly, impacted by this. So I think it's a broad coalition that we try and connect with just a lot of other voices and perspectives on this. But if in this kind of case, where we really think is going to be powerful is people sharing their stories and sharing the impact of what it would mean to lose health coverage or to lose nutrition assistance. And we all know that those things, like, that's not nothing, like the fundamental importance of having access to healthcare and healthy food to be able to stay in the workforce and hold a job is absolutely essential. So I hope that answers the question, but that's kind of where we see is the importance of the huge implications of some of these proposals.
Thank you, Amelia. And I'm going to stick with you, actually, briefly. One other issue we know Friends are really concerned about is climate change and how we can, especially in this new political environment, how we can act on that. So I know it's not an issue we covered today, but the tax piece, the reconciliation piece, and the clean energy work that we work so hard for is something that Darren on our environment team is working on. Can you speak a little bit to that for Friends?
Sure, yeah, and absolutely. I mean, climate is the other piece that's going to be included in this reconciliation package and trying to kind of claw back a lot of the investments that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's another aspect. And some of those provisions, like some of the clean energy incentives have pretty strong bipartisan support. So again, there is an avenue there, depending upon the members of Congress, to try and pull away support where members don't want to vote for a bill that claws back some of that. I mean, Anika also leads our domestic policy team, so she might have more to say on that too.
Well, I'm going to Anika next with a couple questions. So she can chime in on that as well if she has anything. Anika, we have a question about ICE and raids, schools, churches, sanctuary places, sensitive areas. Bridget touched on that at the top of the call of what some Quaker communities are doing. Can you speak a little bit more to what people can do and what we and Friends are doing?
Sure. So for going back to the 1990s, there have been different iterations of sort of protections for places where we know it's important for people to be able to gather, to get resources. So places of worship, schools, libraries, hospitals. And we saw those protections strengthened more during the Biden administration, but the Trump administration last year, or last week rather, rescinded those protections for schools and places of worship and for hospitals. And we have already seen attempts by immigration and customs enforcement to try and complete raids in some of those spaces. There were reports about churches in Metro Atlanta over the weekend, and so the levity of the threat is not fully clear to us, but we do want to ensure that folks are preparing in the ways that they need to. And so part of our Know Your Rights materials does include things along the lines of thinking about what does it mean to be a formally known sensitive location that is threatened under the Trump administration. What are the sort of protocols we can be putting in place? Just in general, knowing what rights people have in engaging with ICE is something that is useful for people who work in those spaces or may be in those spaces. As Bridget mentioned and Justin repeated, there is litigation that many Quakers filed. That litigation will not get into the specifics of that, but I do hope it at least starts with an injunction to relieve some of the stress that communities will be facing. It's a really bleak time to see that, particularly knowing the importance of what those protections have meant. The reality is, even when those protections were in place, there was never a complete blanket. It just meant that there was more discretion in which enforcement was working. So they weren't sitting in a parking lot when a church with a high known immigrant population would be released, or they weren't circling around the 2-block radius of a school. And so to see that being infringed upon, really, it has the potential of causing a chilling effect for people not going to the spaces that they need to be and finding the care and sort of sacredness that they need in places of worship and so forth.
Thanks, Anika. And again, I'm going to stick with you for a moment. Can you speak about one of the bills that came through really quickly in Congress in the last few days, the Laken Riley Act, and how does that fit into what we're seeing on the Hill and the administration?
And so the Lake and Riley Act is a legislation that is in the namesake of a nursing student in Georgia who was murdered allegedly at the hands of an undocumented immigrant. Very tragic occurrence, and we saw it for a year plus, very heightenedly politicized within Congress. And last week we saw the House and the Senate both pass those. And so essentially, what it does is it adds another layer of mandatory detention for individuals who have had entanglements with the criminal legal system. And it is not limited to someone who has had a conviction. It could be someone who was charged, someone who was arrested. It can be for petty thefts. So really beyond the scope of what is typical for imposing incarceration on individuals. And mandatory detention, particularly without options of bail, again, is pretty unconstitutional and rare for us to see. And the reality is that for the Department of Homeland Security, they already had the ability to detain those that they deemed it to be some sort of public safety threat. And so this added layer actually just causes more confusions. One of the most frightening parts of it is the ability for attorney generals at the state level to be able to bring up individual cases that they find issue with that could impose bans nationally. And so someone might have a issue that they have related to an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala, for example, and the decisions of that could end up impacting visas that are issued to people from those countries. And so the breadth of which this bill also has is pretty unprecedented and has the ability to create long-lasting damage.
Thanks, Anika. And then Hassan, I know we have a few questions about UNRWA. Do you want to take those in bulk? I know you had a few that you can lump together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the questions was, can you tell us the amount of UNRWA funding we're hoping to restore and compare that amount to the amount of military aid we're giving to Israel? The other question was, isn't Israel about to have a law that's going to affect preventing UNRWA aid in Gaza scheduled to go into effect at the end of this month? Let me take both of those at the same time, just so we can, for the sake of time here. So since October 7, the United States has given $22+ billion. So we've approved $22 billion in weaponry to the Israeli government. These are all sorts of weapons like joint direct attack munitions, small diameter bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, tank munitions, artillery shells. Really, just so much weaponry has gone in there. And look at that versus the about 300 million a year we give in assistance to the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. So that's the disparity we're dealing with. Hundreds of millions for humanitarian aid and 22 billion for weapons of war. So we want to flip that. We want to make sure that humanitarian funding is getting what it needs. On the Knesset law, I'm glad you brought that up. I had a very short amount of time to present, so I didn't want to go into all these details. But yeah, that's a really good flag. In October, the Israeli Knesset passed a law preventing Israeli officials and Kogat, the organization inside the Israeli government that handles, the border and certain security aspects inside Gaza itself. They prevented them from being able to interact with UNRWA, and that's going to have a really detrimental effect. We actually don't know fully what the ramifications of that law will be. We're totally committed to working to restore UNRWA funding and I'll say why in a second, as I already alluded to earlier in my comments. But this is going to be a real obstacle for UNRWA's abilities to be able to operate in the region. We know that for sure. There are a couple proposals on the table. One is to fold some of UNRWA's work into the other UN agencies, like World Food Program, things of that nature, UNSCO, and a few other organizations they're looking at. Some people are thinking maybe UNDP could handle some of this. There's also folks looking at, could some of this be done, some of this humanitarian response be done by other Arab countries like the Saudis, UAE, Qatar, and others. So really definitely an uncertain time, but we think it's so important to continue putting pressure and working to restore this humanitarian assistance to millions of Palestinians in Gaza. And the more pressure we put on the situation, the more leverage lawmakers are going to have to try to get the best deal possible for humanitarian access, funding restoration, and that is going to have a real impact on the ground. So great questions, and back to Justin.
Thank you, Hassan. I'm gonna now go back to Amelia because we've had some really great questions, of course, about issues that are important to Friends, but also some advocacy tactics and strategies. So one that came up from several friends was about how can progressive members of Congress be effective? And we know, we get a question a lot of, my member of Congress agrees with me on everything. What can they do? What can I do? So Amelia, can you speak to that a little bit and how you're navigating working with progressive members of Congress? And Hassan, you might have some thoughts on this that we can come to as well.
Sure. So I think there are a couple things. One is we want to make sure that there is still a lot of attention. Like there's a lot, they have a platform and that they can still use their platform to also lift up and call out kind of what we're facing, the consequences of what they're facing, the stories that they are hearing in their district. So I think that kind of publicly, the more that that there is attention to what the consequences of the legislation that we're talking about, the more that will make it that will put increasingly more pressure as well on others on kind of what we're talking about. I think the other thing too is in lobby visits. I often use that time with if I'm in an office that agrees with me already, is to use that time for strategy. So to get feedback from them on who are other key members of Congress that we should be working with, or any insights that they have had, because many of these members of Congress, they do talk with each other across the aisle. They work with so there's a whole ecosystem within Capitol Hill. And so being able to get insights and intelligence from them on kind of what they're hearing, what they're learning, suggestions for our advocacy. And then that's really important to communicate back to us so that we can constantly be kind of revising and updating our strategies based on what we're hearing from you in your conversations and our conversations on the Hill as well. So those are a couple things that we oftentimes point to. I'll say one final thing is, many times, and this goes to my first point, we will hear, you go into an office and you talk with and they're like, we're with you. You don't need to convince us. We're with you. But that's different from like, I will take the right vote when it comes to it, to I will be out there. I will be speaking out against this. I will be pushing for this, whatever it is, and to make it really a priority for the member. And so getting them to, as I was saying before, really speak out publicly about some of these things is another kind of, it is a step beyond just like, hey, I'm with you, but really trying to make sure that there's vocal support there.
Thanks, Amelia. Hassan or Anika, did you want to add anything briefly to that?
Yeah, and the question is around engaging progressive lawmakers in this moment under Trump.
Yeah, and Hassan, if I can say, I know you've also had some success with more moderate members, and even a meeting with the Republican office today. If you want to speak to how you're working with all members, I think folks would appreciate it.
we need to, everybody has a role to play here. We're not going to leave anyone behind. You know, if someone's, you know, opposed to the agenda, can we get them to be more passively opposed? You know, that all of this is important. I will say that in the first Trump administration, we also learned a lot how, you know, progressives and certain libertarian Republicans united to advance really key pieces of legislation like the Yemen War Powers Resolution. Shout out to the advocacy teams that worked on that back in the day. We passed the Iran War Powers Resolution with this kind of progressive and libertarian coalition building. And we passed several resolutions to block weapon sales to both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and really put a lot of pressure, change U.S. policy, got the Trump administration to respond, and advanced diplomacy on the ground that saved tens of thousands of lives. So there absolutely is a role to play for everybody, especially on the foreign policy and Middle East side of things. Oh, and yeah, just to answer your question about the lawmaker, we had a meeting with Senator Cassidy's office about sending U.S. Navy hospital ships off the coast of Gaza, and they seemed interested. They were considering being the first Republican senator to speak out about the issue. So again, everything matters. Let's keep going. Back to Justin.
Thank you, Hassan. And we're going to wrap up here with one final question. Thank you again, friends, for submitting those questions, and we've been collecting them as well. Bridget, this one I think is over to you. Is there work being done through FCNL to address the ban on DEI programs in the government?
Thanks, Justin. Yes, we were very concerned about this, and of course, FCNL has our own commitments and advocates for advancing anti-racism, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our society and our institutions and our own organizations. And so when the Trump administration made these sweeping bans on all the DEI and defunding and firing, there has been an interfaith letter that was organized, which FCNL just signed on to in the last day or two. It's hard to keep track of time these days. So we are joining with other faith colleagues in calling this out, pushing back against it, and continuing to advocate for a more just, diverse, and inclusive country in all aspects.
Thank you, Bridget. I know that was on the hearts and minds of some friends. All right, friends, we are wrapping up here. We'll be finishing in the next few minutes. So just a recap of some things to keep an eye out for. Some wonderful plugs in the call about advocacy teams, and also just going to the FCNL website. We have lots of really great content and blogs and resources being updated, you know, as we speak. So please check that out. And as the director of our strategic advocacy team, Levita Davis, likes to say, let me put a bug in your ear. And let me do that by reminding you, keep an eye out for a follow-up email tomorrow that'll have a bunch of the links, actions, opportunities, and resources that have been discussed on this call. And again, you can always contact us at lobby@fcnl.org with questions, with ideas, with requests. We're happy to be supportive in ways that we're able. And lastly, one of the main pieces in that email tomorrow, that follow-up email, will be about this way that you can express interest in taking specific actions on the issues you heard about today, as well as other issues FCNL is working on. So really, I hope you get some rest this evening. We all need rest as we get going. But before we close this evening, I'm happy to turn it over to Bridget once again to close us out. Thank you again, friends.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, friends. Thank you, everyone who joined us this evening. We were up around 600 people, I saw at one point, and that is so encouraging to us. At the beginning of the call, I asked, how are we going to get through the coming months, years? How are we going to do that? How are we going to sustain ourselves and our community and our advocacy for the world we seek? I know that we are going to do that with your actions with us, as you've heard, and I hope you are taking away actions. Feel free to share in the chat an action that you are committing to doing after this call. And we are going to sustain ourselves and our community through your spiritual support and our spiritual grounding as a community, to remember, as Anika reminded us, that Spirit is on the side of justice and peace, and we will not let the chaos sweep us up in it. We will stay grounded with you all through our faith and putting it into those actions. We also will sustain ourselves through financial support, and I will be very direct. We will need your financial support. We have huge challenges in front of us. FCNL cannot do this work without all of you and without donations and financial support. So thank you to everyone who already gives to FCNL in many, many ways. One particular way I want to invite you to help sustain us all and our advocacy through this time is to become a monthly sustainer for FCNL. I'm a monthly sustainer. It's an easy way to just know you are giving and contributing every month to this work. And that is such a gift to us. It really is. We're going to put in the chat, if it's not already there, the link where you can sign up to be a monthly sustainer if you're not already one. And there are lots of other ways to give. Every donation counts. So thank you to everyone who already is a sustainer, who donates regularly, who might want to donate for the very first time from this call. Thank you so much. And we know that we will do this work and hold one another together up through it. I want to close now with a closing prayer. And I love these prayers from the Book of Tiny Prayer by Micah Busey. This prayer is for those who want to change the world. And we know, friends, that we are still going to work to change the world. We are still committed. May you remember that you are doing just that, even when you can't immediately see the shifts. May you connect with others who are open to learning from you and who can also teach you their own ways of sustaining themselves through what feels like agonizingly slow movements. And may you find at least one thing today, perhaps it was this call, one thing today that ignites your faith in the fact that we are in a time of both foundation shaking and foundation rebuilding, a disorienting and reorienting moment in which we will all need to keep reminding one another of the undeniably transformative parts we are each playing every single day. Thank you, friends, for all those ways you are continuing to help change the world. We are here for you. We are here with you. We know you are with us. And we are so grateful that you spent this time with us this evening. Onward to more actions together.